great work that you've done. So I want to share a little bit about your background. So a professor at Emerita.
I'm a professor emerita,
Emerita.
which means that I retired, but I can use the name of the university for the rest of my life because they granted me what would be for a man emeritus and for a woman emerita status.
Okay.
But that's given separately after you retire if they feel you should be awarded some association with the university for the rest of your life. Obviously, it's a decision made by some group at the university that has decided that whatever you have published or would be publishing is going to be worth having the university's name associated with.
Okay. In the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. And you held the 21st Century Chair in Teacher Quality.
Right. The chairs were separate from the actual position of professorship, but that's a detail that relates to state legislature and rules and procedures and could vary from state to state. But I had a chair which was separately endowed, and that's something people sometimes are interested in because the Walton family is one of the important families in Arkansas higher education because they wanted to increase the visibility of their efforts, let me put it that way. They knew their sister Alice was building this museum called Crystal Bridges in Bentonville, which is not too far, but it's in northwest Arkansas. And the university's flagship campus, which was the one I was at, was in Fayetteville, which is also part of northwest Arkansas in the Ozarks.
Oh, wow.
People have very old ideas about who is in the Ozarks.
Yeah, there's a new TV show about the Ozarks right now.
Well, I learned that the French had named a lot of those places when they came down the Mississippi trading and were establishing Indian posts for fur, trading of furs back in the 17th, 18th century. And so northwest Arkansas, which was where the Ozarks were, some are a little bit in Missouri because we're close to the borderline of Missouri, were where you had a lot of Scots-Irish immigrants from Scotland who had gone to Northern Ireland, and then because of the ethnic cleansing that took place there, some of them came to Canada, others came to the Ozarks, Smoky Mountains.
Interesting. And so you've done all kinds of research, from teacher licensure testing. You have
some in that area too.
Right, a lot of that in that area.
Local schools.
You've done stuff in literature and reading curriculum, academic achievement in single-sex classrooms. You've critiqued on Common Core standards in the English arts and mathematics, U.S. history, civic engagement, and aspects of the Common Core project. I mean, I can go on and on and on. You've written books. You're an advocate of standards-based reform and strong academic standards and assessments for students and teachers. And today I wanted to share much of your research, and you are a legend when it comes to just teaching and making sure that teachers are meeting their standards, right?
Right. It was making sure that they were academically qualified to teach to the higher standards for kids in K-12 in major subjects. And what we achieved, or what I was able to achieve through the standards, which the teachers in Massachusetts had a great deal of input in, because I would bring them in by grade levels to give us advice. I would call on academic experts in math, English, science, other areas, and they would give me their advice on content, subject matter content. And then the teachers would come in and give advice on where to place the content for appropriate teaching, because that was what they needed to be sure about for K-12. So I was constantly meeting teachers at different levels and having experts from all over the country in every area possible who are delighted to be able to give advice on what the content in these disciplines should be, because I wasn't vetting what they told me, they were vetting what they told me.
And this is so important because you only have so many hours in the day. So you want to maximize that time with the students, with the children. And this is very important. You're also a big implementer of MIRA. You have also,
It was all done under the Massachusetts Ed Reform Act of '93. And that was brought about and written by 3 significant politically active people at the time. Governor Weld, the governor at the time, that MIRA mostly was being written, and Mark Roosevelt, who was in the House of Representatives in Massachusetts, because mainly the focus was on state money for a foundation formula, as they called it, that would give all school systems in the state more money. And then Tom Birmingham, who was Senate President. And the 3 men, who all were graduates of Harvard Law School, so they could all speak the same language and they could understand each other, wrote probably one of the best pieces of legislation. I was, in a sense, the administrator of MIRA, M-E-R-A, in the Department of Education, because their main concern, as Tom Birmingham told me years later, was to improve teacher academic quality. They saw the business people in this state were behind MIRA. That was why it got through the state legislature, which wasn't generally happy about increasing or giving tax money to schools for more to do with education. People in the state legislature were not terribly happy with our schools of education. Kids had been doing less well before 1993, according to them, during the 70s and 80s. And businesses, the big banks and other institutions in Massachusetts were spending a huge amount of money for in-house classrooms. They would hire people who had been educators or knew something about what the school curriculum should be. And they were spending money training their workers for what they thought the public schools should be doing to begin with. So they were, and Jack Rennie is the businessman who died of a heart attack before I ever had a chance to meet him, but his name is often referred to by people who had something to do with MERA, MIRA, because he was able to reach a number of the CEOs who were in charge of the big banks or other institutions, financial institutions in the Boston area, and make sure that there would be support for what would be called the foundation formula, which was to pull up students who were low achievers if they could, and to improve philosophically everybody. That was the major thrust, and I mention that because it turns out this was almost the opposite of what Common Core was about. And we didn't realize what a gold mine we had in this wonderful bill that was, as I told Tom Birmingham, the best piece of progressive legislation I had ever encountered, and I was in charge of implementing it because the philosophy was to improve everybody. It wasn't just to improve the bottom, and it wasn't just to improve the top students. It was to improve everybody. So we were trying to raise scores for the whole group of people who would be employed as high school graduates or more in this state. And we were, and it worked. I mean, Massachusetts became the first state to reach the top with its students after we got our standards in place and implemented. But we had students who are now hitting the top in grade 4 and grade 8 in English and in math, both. was the only state that ever accomplished that.
Wow, what an accomplishment. And,
And then science, we tied with Singapore.
right, wow.
That was an international test, and we were doing even better on an international test over which we had no control, so no one could ever accuse us of in any way manipulating
Right.
the test.
You were also on part of the validation of Common Core.
That was when Common Core came down the pike, which was in '09 and '10.
And you were part of the fight to reclaim control of education by local districts.
Yes, because that was part of the problem that I saw with Common Core, that it was taking away the local control of curriculum that had made a huge amount of difference to how local school systems would address whatever they saw as their needs, because they were on top of, just as we now have with police departments and other agencies that serve at the local level and are usually paid for out of local taxes.
Yeah, everything comes down to standards, testing, maintaining high quality and excellence in every industry. I think that is a mark of what all your life efforts are towards.
We were trying to raise up the education system because it underlies everything else. The employment situation and the colleges students go on to if they do. And not everybody necessarily wants to go to a college. We also had a very flourishing and very high level vocational education system, regional high schools in this state. And those were important. I advised on the licensing test because it was a separate system for the coursework, the shops, which were not they were not academic, so they wouldn't have been under my charge.
And so tell me, what inspired you to become a teacher?
To begin with, I became a teacher because I had been inspired. I grew up in Bridgewater, a very small town south of Brockton, and my model was my Latin teacher and my plane geometry teacher, the same person, but in a small town high school. And I don't know what size high school you went to, but in a small town high school, teachers often taught more than one major subject. We couldn't even afford one full-time math teacher in the high school that I went to. So different people picked up different pieces, and the Latin teacher, who was wonderful, she'd been there for like 35 years, since World War I. And she was my model for the 4 years of Latin that I took in high school, and taught everybody in the high school plane geometry in the 10th grade, because that was when the school would use its old textbooks that went back for many years, because you could look in the front of the book and see the stamp on it that would tell you how far back this is typical of New England. You had people who bought textbooks back in the 20s and 30s, and students were still using the same textbooks 20 years later because they didn't change textbooks in major subjects. History was the only subject that you would have current events to add, and we were using the best that the town could buy, the U.S. history textbook by David Muzzy, and historians would remember him because his textbook was, for several generations, the history textbook used by most students in this entire country. And it only went up to World War II. So anything that happened after World War II, you had to make sure that you had other material available. But I was modeling my interest in education on a teacher who, to me, was one of the best teachers, because towns in those days for high school could hire whoever they wanted. That was one of the things I later learned, that while teacher licensing in New England for the high school years took place in the 60s and 70s, before then, schools could hire for high school teaching anyone they thought was qualified. We had loads of liberal arts colleges, and was very unusual, and it was one of the reasons you had these outstanding people teaching in high school, because they didn't have to go to an ed school and get a degree in an ed school in order to teach. They could be a graduate in Greek and Latin at a liberal arts college, and if the town thought they could work well and they had teacher evaluations, population was smaller, then they could hire and rehire. And of course, salaries were low, and they didn't have unions in those days either. So towns had a superintendent who pretty much could do whatever the superintendent wanted to do if they were looking for quality. And when I got married and had 5 children and moved to Brookline, one of the major reasons I moved to Brookline was because it was known for its excellent school system. So I knew that my 5 children would have a good K-12 education, regardless of which elementary school they went to. And that was what I wanted to be assured of.
And that's what's common today. Everyone wants to move into that town that they feel their children in the public school system are getting the best education possible.
Right.
Right?
And those kinds of standards were developed in later years because there were great fears that one of the reasons we had a growing number of low achievers in later years was because the teachers weren't as qualified for high school as earlier ones. I was, of course, still trying to beef up elementary teaching because all kids go to elementary school, no matter where they live. But you have to have certain coursework to make sure. And I grew up in the town that had a state teachers college founded by Horace Mann, who was known from the 19th century as one of the major national educators in the country. He set up state boards of education, and Massachusetts was the first state, I believe, to have compulsory education as part of a state requirement, so that children who came from immigrant families would have to go to school. You then had these compulsory education laws, child labor laws, later on, because I looked into a lot of that on my own just to find out the background to what I was doing. And Massachusetts was always considered one of the most educated, if not the state with the highest degree of education, the number of college graduates, number of private colleges, small colleges, didn't matter what they were, but they could be bigger schools, smaller schools, but it was the education of people, particularly immigrants, because it was one of the major states for immigrants coming from Europe.
And we still want to believe that today.
Yes.
In 2020. And so why do you feel, or tell me a little bit about how important scholarly and civic values are imparted into students today by our taxpayers' money?
Very important, because I was a recipient of those from my high school history teacher. Now, one of the things that made New England unique was something called town meeting, which was the form of government we have in New England. It was spread in different ways by people from New England who then moved out west, particularly after the Civil War. But remember, abolitionism was centered in Massachusetts in particular, around the Boston, New Bedford area, where you had ministers and others who were very concerned about the issue of slavery, although what Lincoln was doing was mainly protecting local government and the Union. And we had people who would talk on preserving the Union, because how else were you going to attract all those young men from New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine to take part in the Civil War? Slavery had been banished, from before the country was even organized as a United States of America, and before Washington became the first president. So you had a lot of young men who needed to feel that they had a cause, and the cause was the preservation of the Union. That was the important thing for them. And Massachusetts was one of the 13 original colonies and had so many of the important leaders to begin with. But freedom, liberty were important issues for the people who were seen as leaders. And John Adams, of course, who wrote our state constitution, came from Massachusetts. And David McCullough, bless his soul, wrote the book about the letters between him and Abigail, his wife, and they lived near Quincy. And this was part of the background. So we had not only state history, local history, but national history all taking place here in Massachusetts, including the famous ports. You lived, I know, near Newburyport, which was one of the major ports, and Salem and Boston, and of course there were several other major ports up and down the eastern seacoast. And after the clipper ships, and seafaring was a major way that people made a living in this particular area, if they lived along the Atlantic coastline or near the islands near New Bedford.
So you've done a lot of research on storytelling and epics. Can you explain how that is so important?
That was because of my interest in children's literature. I wasn't so much an expert in storytelling as I relied upon people who came with immigrant groups. And I was told when I was teaching 2 courses at Harvard, Graduate School of Education, in children's literature, that Irish storytellers were among the best, because Ireland for many years had been semi-literate or not a high level of literacy, and they had storytellers, one of whom was at the South Boston branch of the public library, and she was recommended to me. So I made sure that we had exposure to storytelling, because every country which had peasants or serfs or whatever before the 19th century, public school systems weren't developed until late into those centuries in most countries. America had one of the highest rates of literacy until the 20th century. Until what happened after World War II was unusual, which was why we developed in this country, in this state, MIRA, to increase the literacy level back to what we had had. But we had always had very demanding implicit standards from the teachers we hired, because we were among the last states to ever require licensing. If, as I mentioned earlier, high school principals could hire whoever they wanted from our many liberal arts colleges in this state, and they didn't need to have education coursework or education degrees. The earlier years, yes, that had been one of Horace Mann's great accomplishments. He had made sure and set up these state colleges for women, young women typically, who would teach in the elementary grades. And I can still remember the ones. They were always a Miss something, because there was the notion that once a woman married, she was going to get married and have children. So you would lose that teacher, and you wanted to have someone who was going to be around for a while. My first grade teacher, her name was Miss Grace Smith, had taught for about 30 years first grade. She was a wonderful teacher, but the town knew it could depend upon her being there from year to year. But once a teacher got married, and this was true in Boston, and they used to talk about the fact that they didn't hire married women, and that's true, but they would dismiss a married woman. Once she got married, goodbye. It seems quaint today.
Oh, that's good. That's funny. So, when did you become aware that the School of Education was not promoting excellence?
when I was in the Department of Education, and it mainly started over the reading issue, which was of course my area of expertise, because I had been one of Jean Shaw's students at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and she was known throughout the country, in fact throughout the world, for being an expert on beginning reading research. And here I was now in a position to wonder, along with people from our education schools in this state, why Massachusetts, like other states, was having a lot of a problem with kids in the early grades, in the primary grades, learning how to read. Were they not being taught any systematic phonics at all? Were they not being taught vocabulary, which was my basic interest? I was not particularly interested in either phonics or the other issues, blended vowels and consonants or other things that beginning teachers do. I was interested in the developing vocabulary knowledge that good readers, because I had always been a good reader, but I wanted to see what we knew about vocabulary and how we could make sure that the vocabulary knowledge was there. And this fit into civic values. That was an earlier question of yours, because I had a history teacher, as I mentioned, who was in town meeting. He was the moderator of town meeting in Massachusetts, in Bridgewater, where I grew up. And he would tell us after town meeting in the spring what happened at town meeting the night before. And I became very interested in this notion of self-government, because this was, to me, the ultimate civic engagement. If people knew how to run their own affairs, if they could manage their own property tax money, because that was the requirement for being a town incorporated into the Commonwealth's Massachusetts Bay Colony, whatever it was called, until the country was founded, then you could have a better sense of civic virtue develop when people had to decide for themselves what they wanted their own tax money based on. And basically, this started, I lived in Brookline for many years, but Brookline was incorporated sometime around 1700. I lived in a town, Bridgewater, that was incorporated in 1656, but it was part of Plymouth County, so it must have had maybe some of the Pilgrim people who came over on the Mayflower. We wouldn't know, because we never did any research into the background of the important families that lived in Bridgewater. It was a small town by the time I grew up in it, with one of the first state prisons, as well as one of the first state colleges, both ends.
Wow.
It had a psychiatrist at the state prison, which was an opening. This was the first time. This was for humane treatment of people with mental problems. Today, we wouldn't even do that. The idea today is more to let them out into small residential area, homes or whatever. But you had the civic knowledge that depended on the vocabulary level of the major terms that were used by people who founded this country. I did work in Eastern Europe, which you may have mentioned earlier, or I think is somewhere, where I went on a civic initiative to Eastern Europe. This was after the Berlin Wall fell, and they had gotten rid of their Marxist-Leninist coursework in K-12, which the Russians had wanted installed in their public schools, and they wanted democratic citizenship, whatever that consisted of, in their schools for K-12, because they didn't want any more Marxist-Leninist. They had had enough of it. We were there as part of the Free Polish Government solidarity that came in after the Berlin Wall had fallen and all of these satellite or other countries in Eastern Europe broke away and decided they wanted to establish their own schools or school systems for their own children as they saw fit. And so they had words to worry about, and I remember one of them being constituent. in Poland, there was no word for constituent. It meant so much in a democracy. How could you not have a word for it in Polish? It didn't exist. They would have to create a word that meant constituent. English had it, but England was the country we were modeled on in many respects. But it, of course, meant that this was someone who had geographical representation. This might be of interest to you
Right.
historically, that here were these countries that had been under central planning and under a central government that had decided who in Warsaw would represent Lublin. And now they wanted someone from Lublin to represent Lublin. So how are they, or someone from Krakow to represent Krakow. And the constituents would be the people who lived in Lublin or Krakow. And so we had to figure out with people who were social studies teachers in Poland, what were some of the key words that they needed to figure out the equivalence of, because they didn't even exist as words, as concepts, which was something we had never thought about. And constituents I remembered because it was so important for elections. I mean, I'm sure you've used that.
Yes, that's all I'm saying right now is, I represent all the constituents in my district, and if you're going to another country, another culture, you're educating them on this. It's a whole new system, and so of course a new word must be created.
Right,
And
it was
that's
a
the term.
concept
Right.
that has to be there. You're representing people and the people who are chosen or elected live in those areas
area.
and know many of the people there. That's what having constituents means. And we were told in education this was vital. They wanted, one of the things, the people that we were interacting with, who were, I would call, the intellectual wing of the Solidarity Party, because they were mainly professors of philosophy or psychology in Poland, they wanted to make sure that the principals of the schools in each town or city in Poland were not chosen by a central committee in Warsaw, but were chosen by the people who lived in that town or city, so that they would have some contacts with local parents and others. That was what was important. That was where they saw local control in the schools coming from, not from a central government, even though they did like the idea that all students would have the same standards. I mean, there were certain things that you did for countries with smaller populations in the United States. But since we developed in such a fragmented way, it was going to be a very different kind of situation here.
And I also think that there are standards, but then you can exceed the standards and you can continue to be better